Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the 2020 Amy Dillwyn Lecture. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this very special online event on behalf of Swansea University's Cultural Institute and CREW, the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales. Tonight's lecture on the fascinating subject of avatars, LGBT storytelling by Amy Dillwyn will be delivered by Professor Kirsty Bohata. Kirsty is co-director of CREW, the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales, and co-chair of the Association for Welsh Writing in English. She is finishing a book on Amy Dillwyn's fiction and is edited with Hugh Osborne and Mihangel Morgan, an anthology of queer short stories from Wales, which will be published by Parthian Books next spring. Before we hand over to Kirsty, it's my great pleasure to welcome Norina Shopland, who will be introducing and chairing tonight's lecture. Originally from Cardiff, Norina has worked for the British Museum, National Museum Scotland, and the Museum of London, among others. Now specialising in researching, recording, and promoting LGBT, women's, and Welsh histories, she is responsible for a number of groundbreaking projects, including the first project in Wales to look at placing sexual orientation and gender identity into Welsh history, that culminated in Welsh Pride, the first exhibition focusing exclusively on this country's LGBT people, allies, and events. Norina's book, Forbidden Lives, LGBT Stories from Wales, is the first completely historical work on Welsh sexual orientation and gender identity. A very warm welcome, Norina.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to hand over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. One of the difficulties that we have with researching or writing about sexual orientation and gender identities from the past is how to find people. The terminology we use today is predominantly modern, and so not available to us when searching historical records. We therefore have to have a greater understanding of the hidden languages that individuals use to refer to themselves and how others refer to them. And throughout the last few years, I've been devising and expanding a new kind of glossary which addresses these issues, and a free copy of Queering Glamorgan can be found on Glamorgan Archives website. And my new book, A Practical Guide to Searching LGBTQIA+ Historical Records, is to be published by Routledge on the 12th of November, and this also tackles this problem. And currently amid my research strands, I'm looking at 3 individuals about whom there are hints and possibilities of their being gay or trans. But that's what we're working with, hints and possibilities. And that sums up much of LGBT+ research, a careful reading between the lines. And when biographies are available, they're often repressed, or the subject or the researchers cut, that leaving out which is not required. Gwen John's enormous amount of correspondence written in French has never been translated with regard to her being a bisexual woman. And there is much left about her, I believe, to still be discovered. And the same with other individuals such as Cranogwen, Sarah Jane Rees, who wrote extensively in Welsh. I've discovered in an Australian newspaper an entire serialized biography of someone whom we would now consider transmasculine, which has never been published outside its original source, and details of the individual appear nowhere else. When you bear in mind this is just my own research and only covering the English language, how much more is there hidden across the world? And we are also short of researchers, and we need a lot more people to be looking. Only rarely are we afforded an insight into lives through diaries and letters. And when they did exist, they were often destroyed. When Mary Lloyd, the partner of Frances Power Cobb, died, she instructed Frances to destroy all her paperwork, an instruction that was carried out, leaving us only with the voice of Frances to reconstruct their lives. And the same is true of the ladies of Llangollen. Only Eleanor's voice has been left to us. And with Amy Dillwyn, we have her diaries, but hear little from Olive, whom Amy referred to as my wife. And when you turn to historical fiction, the situation is similar. Scholars have speculated on numerous 19th century, earlier 20th century works suggesting in the lack of direct evidence, sexual and gender fluid subtext. And using the methodology I've decided for searching historical records, I found a number of stories featuring that which seems to be whom characters we would today regard as gay or trans. And I've been working with Kirsty on getting some of them published. However, often the authors are unknown, and we cannot contrast the fiction with the lives of the creators. When authors and their works are known, often they are still not known. For example, the famous 19th century French archaeologist Jane Delafoy wrote several novels that explored gender. Volontaire, written in 1892, is considered to be one of the earliest trans novels, but when a rare copy appeared on eBay in 2020 for €130, it was not tagged as such and had no buyers. It's since disappeared, so either it was bought or it's been withdrawn, and it can't be found anywhere else. Indeed, when it comes to the availability of 19th century fiction, we are faced with a certain number of problems. Although through platforms such as Google Books, Internet Archive, and others, thousands of fictional works are available, those that are selected for inclusion are similar to the researcher's cut, depend on who selects them and who scans them. Anything that includes LGBT+ material is often not tagged as such, and locating them is often through laborious efforts, putting in various search terms to check the text. How much, therefore, is still missing? And the point I'm making here is how difficult it is to find people from the past, to identify historical authors, to get hidden works published. So in this respect, with regard to Amy Dilwyn, we are extremely fortunate. Not only are her works widely available, but through her diaries and other sources, her fiction can be compared and contrasted to her life and views. And we're also extremely fortunate to have Kirsty to interpret Amy's work for us. And I, for one, I'm looking forward for what she has to tell us. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Kirsty.
Thank you, Norina. Okay, it is a slightly odd setup for me. We should all be getting used to it by now. But I can't see you, and so I'm going to imagine you all are sitting there with a drink of your choice, relaxing and not glazing over, which will be a challenge. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully what you will be able to see are my slides, and hopefully you'll be able to keep a square of me, of my face in the corner. Right, so before we begin, I should say really thank you for coming. It's quite a nerve-wracking thing to do, and I really appreciate the fact that you've turned up. Huge thanks to Elaine Canning and her team at the Cultural Institute for doing all the hard work on this, and thank you very much to Norina for coming and opening this, because I've been a great admirer of her work, and she's already done a great deal to publicise what Amy Dilwyn has done in various roles as organiser and writer. So, and she's also been a fantastic source for the queer short stories, which we're publishing in the spring. So this talk is about Amy Dilwyn's fiction. It's about 35 minutes, maximum 40 minutes long, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. Dilwyn was a radical novelist, but she was also a feminist and an activist, and in later life, an industrialist. She was also a lesbian, although she might not have used that language to describe herself. I'm going to use it as a shorthand here now. Her fiction is often read as having strong autobiographical dimensions, but I think it's a bit more complicated than that. At least the autobiographical elements are both more pervasive and also more complicated than has been recognised. So I will offer a very quick overview of her life, a very short one, kind of assuming that you are not all familiar with her personal life. And then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about her use of queer avatars in her fiction. So here's a picture of Amy Dilwyn with her beloved brother, Harry. He is actually a year older than her, but she seems very much in charge in these pictures, showing him what to notice in their shared book. And the pose in the smaller picture in which they're playing cards was carefully set up by Amy Dilwyn herself, because she wanted to be, quote, different. She didn't like conventional Victorian poses. And in this one, she's looking directly at the camera as her brother looks down at his cards. So she's fairly deliberately reversing accepted gender roles. And later in her literature, she would portray brother-sister relationships, a brother-sister couple, as an example of gender equality. Here she is as a child again on her father's lap, wearing his hat. And she would later step into his shoes as an industrialist when he left her his spelter works, his zinc works, in his will. At that time, she described herself as becoming a man of business. And she did prove herself as an industrialist. She took what was a company on the verge of bankruptcy and ended up making her own modest fortune, and she bought her own house. She had been living in lodgings during, well, since her father died, because his belongings were sold. And meanwhile, Hendrevoilen, which was the family home, the mansion that her father had built and where Amy had grown up, was entailed to the male line. So her nephew ended up inheriting the house. As you can see from the image in front of you, Dilwyn cut a very masculine figure, particularly if you look at her in comparison with the two ladies in the group. There's a blow up of that detail of Amy Dilwyn in the front row there with her trademark trilby hat and one of the line of dogs that she had as really important pets in her life. In the newspaper articles at the bottom, again, sort of emphasize her masculinity. The one that says on the brain should in full reads economy on the brain, because she was noted for her business sense, which again, you know, an ability with numbers and a business acumen are kind of masculine traits. She became something of a celebrity as a businesswoman, one of the most remarkable women in Great Britain, according to the Pall Mall Gazette. Though, despite her recognised skills as an administrator and a manager, she could not always overcome what one local newspaper called the sex discrimination, which debarred her from being elected. They say the sex discrimination is, however, so real that her recognised administrative ability and freedom from the feminine idiosyncrasies, which might prove embarrassing at gatherings of businessmen, failed to remove it. I'm not quite sure what those feminine idiosyncrasies are, but that's clearly what's kept women out of business rooms for so long. She was also famous for smoking cigars, the ultimate masculine prop. Gender theorists have suggested that masculinity, as well as femininity, is performed, and that props or prosthetics are part of the performance of masculinity. Think James Bond with his cars and his lethal gadgetry, or even spitting image representations of Margaret Thatcher, where she was pictured in a suit with a cigar. Dilwyn's cigar was certainly a clear representation of her gender queerness, her disruption of gender norms, although she did actually also really love cigars for their own sake and smoked them in private as well as in public. She had very clear ideas on what was a good cigar and the right size of cigar. So to move on to her writing, I'm going to show you a couple of autobiographical characters who obviously draw on Dilwyn's own life, and then we'll move on to some of her more complex avatars. So Dilwyn could be described as a tomboy. I think that's evident in some of those early pictures and other descriptions of the family, descriptions that the family left of Amy as a child. she loved rough and tumble outdoor behaviour. She was a good horsewoman. She enjoyed riding. And in A Burglary, which was published in 1883 as her third novel, she portrays a tomboy called Imogen, who has a brother slightly older than her and lives just outside a Welsh town in an upper-class family, a family that has an interest in entomology, the study of insects. The opening scenes show a brother and a sister dressed almost identically in Welsh flannel, having fun chasing moths in the dark, and later they go fishing. Amy's family were active in science, and her sister Minnie, her older sister Minnie, who was Mary Nicol as a married woman, was a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. So mothing was a big Dilwyn thing. Imogen also quotes some of Amy Dilwyn's own favourite poetry that she talks about in her diaries, and Imogen ardently believes in the equality of the sexes. I think both women, to a degree, can be described by the quote that is on the slide from A Burglary. Imogen's energetic nature was a somewhat curious compound of ardent love of running wild with a genuine desire to do right. Imogen, the tomboy, and the tomboy is a figure so important in lesbian writing. Imogen is also in love with her wealthy cousin Ethel, which mirrors Amy Dilwyn's passion for Olive Talbot, a relative by marriage and one of the wealthy Talbots of Margam Castle. In another novel, her first novel, The Rebecca Rioter, Miss Gwenllian is the most obvious autobiographical figure. The novel itself is narrated by a Welsh labourer who finds himself in love with Miss Gwenllian. She is the daughter of the local squire, who's also a magistrate, like her father, like Dilwyn's father. Miss Gwenllian takes an interest in the poor. She visits them when they're sick, and she teaches them reading, just as Amy did, although Amy had quite a low opinion of her own talents in this area. But Dilwyn nevertheless went to houses where there was cholera outbreaks. She intervened in cases of abuse. And in fact, the landlord who beats his so-called half-wit daughter in The Rebecca Rioter in the novel draws on someone that Amy Dilwyn encountered, and it's in the 1860s. And Dilwyn also taught literacy classes. But more importantly, she, like Miss Gwenllian, challenged the prevalent view that rich and poor were almost of different species or of two nations. And there's that quote on the slide where Evan thinks that Miss Gwenllian was always heartily welcome to whatever cottage she went. I never came across any other of the gentry who knew how to behave what I call properly to a poor person in his own home. That is, without the condescension and the kind of privilege and the entitlement that some wealthy people were perceived as displaying in when they went out sort of doing their kind of Lady Bountiful duties. So there are some obvious Dilwyn figures, but I think that what is much more interesting than these autobiographical sort of self-portraits are what I'm going to call the avatars that Dilwyn created to explore queer sexualities and gender. I'm adopting the term avatar as a useful way of suggesting that Dilwyn used some less obviously autobiographical characters and some quite complex characters to explore concerns of hers which she articulates also in her diaries, and which I think we can read in her literature as clear experiments in the representation of LGBT figures. And I should say that here that I'm not using LGBT as a synonym for queer or as a sort of catch-all term in the way that sort of BAME is used for Black and minority ethnic communities as a sort of an amorphous blob. I actually mean that Dilwyn represents at different times, although sometimes in the same character, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender identities. So this is why I chose this title for the talk rather than using queer, which is a term I would also favour. So avatars are, originally it's a Sanskrit word which refers to the idea from Hindu mythology of the descent of a deity to earth in incarnate form, but obviously much more modern meaning of the word is its adoption to mean a kind of graphical representation of a person or a character in a computer generated environment, particularly in gaming settings, where they can move about and interact with surroundings, but they can be really quite complex and imaginative and decidedly queer. Well, they are in my kids' versions of avatars. So why not just talk about queer characters or LGBT plots? I think the word avatar is useful here for two reasons. Firstly, because Dilwyn really did use her fiction as an imaginative escape, much as gamers might escape into online lives and identities today. And second, because Dilwyn clearly had questions about her own gender identity and how to present her lesbian or same-sex desires in literature. So what I would argue is that her literary avatars allow her to overcome physical and gender disabilities. So the quotes on the slide are about physical and gender disabilities. On the left is her discussion about her physical impairments. She had an illness which left her more or less confined to the sofa. So she says in August 1872, "I want to go out, but I am compelled to stay in. I want to go to Harry, her brother, and talk to him perhaps, but I am compelled to be on a sofa. I want to use my body and am compelled only to use my mind. I think of one thing, and what that one thing is, no one else knows." This is in the context of her discussing her desire to spend more time and potentially live with Olive. So I think that one thing is Olive. And later on in December 1888, when she looks back on her diary, which ends in 1875 as a regular daily journal, she says that she's been stuck fast to a sofa, almost wholly like a limpet to its rock for many years. You know, she's still on the sofa in December 1888. But she says, "I have written one effect of my solitary and sofa life is that I have written 2 or 3 books," and then she lists a handful. "I haven't any genius for literature or literary composition, and only take it as a piece aller using my brains because I can't use my muscles, which last I should greatly prefer." So sometimes the energy of the outdoor kind of adventures of Evan in the Rebecca Rioter and her other characters in her novels really do feel like an imaginative escape from that sofa. But she's also trying to explore ways of escaping from the limitations of Victorian femininity and womanhood. So on the right-hand side of the slide, there are some quotes from her diary from actually earlier in her life when she was about 19 or 20. "I always say that VC men are my special admiration. One of the reasons why I should like to be a man is that then I should have a chance for getting the VC, and I know I do my best for it." And she often imagines, she constructs a fantasy world where she imagines herself as a knight. She doesn't necessarily imagine that she is a man when she's a knight, but she just imagines herself as a knight. And chivalry as a model and a motif in the Rebecca Rioter and some other stories. So that middle quote is, "I should like to have been a knight in the old days of chivalry, and whether she cared for me or not, I would never have deserted my lady love while I lived." So that also is a motif that supports Dilwyn through unrequited love, because the model of chivalrous knightly love is to worship your lady from afar. In fact, I'd say that the knight errant is almost more important is a more important lesbian device in her writing than the tomboy. And this last quote on the slide refers to this sort of ongoing crush that she has on the Princess of Wales, as she comments on her quite often in her diaries. "Saw the Princess of Wales riding in the park. The first time I have seen her this year. I think her looking prettier than ever. If I were a knight errant, in the old days of chivalry, I would devote myself entirely to her." She uses the imagery of a knight also often when she's thinking about Olive, and I think in this picture she is positioning herself again as a knight in the service of Olive Talbot. The composition of the picture clearly draws on this idea of the kneeling, devoted lover looking up to her somewhat detached lady love. And well, the quote underneath, I'll just read to you. "My mind is taken with one line out of Guinevere, and worship her with years of noble deeds," which represents how a knight should win his lady love. That's just what I should like to do for Olive. How can I make my deeds noble to worship her with them? And I think that one way in which Dilwyn continued to worship Olive was through writing. Almost all Dilwyn's novels are in some senses a confirmation of the value of unrequited love. Dilwyn lamented that Olive didn't feel the same kind of passion for her as she felt for Olive. And although they were close friends, it seems to have been a really a mainly one-way desire. But Dilwyn, although this was sort of this type of love wasn't returned from Olive, nevertheless, Dilwyn was always adamant that her love for Olive and Olive's influence on her was ultimately for the good. I think I need to skim over these images of Joan of Arc. This is moving just one step back from Dilwyn's fiction at the moment, just pursuing this idea of the knight and also how it links and overlaps with imagery of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was an important image of a female warrior and was an important icon for gender nonconformity and Christian allegory in Victorian times. She's also surprisingly popular in the contemporary world of computer avatars, as I discovered once I started researching this. But there was one particular image that Dilwyn was drawn to, and it was this one by John Everett Millais, Joan of Arc, 1865, which Dilwyn saw on its first exhibition at the Royal Academy. She says, "One of the paintings that struck me most was Joan of Arc by Millais. I liked the face extremely. There was such a wonderful combination of enthusiasm and devotion and anxiety and almost a look of doubt in it, as though for an instant she felt uncertain of her own mission." I think it's quite tempting to read this almost as a self-portrait too, as a description of Dilwyn herself. And it was written in the same period that she was considering joining an Anglican sisterhood. She didn't in the end. Okay, so let's have a look now at some examples of these LGBT avatars in Dilwyn's writing. The Rebecca Writer was her first novel. It was about the uprisings, the Rebecca uprisings of 1839 to 1843, which saw men dressed in women's clothes with blackened faces destroying the hated toll gates, which were such a heavy tax upon the poor. Dilwyn was clearly drawn to the sort of the topic of cross-dressing that was a part of the historical Rebecca riots. And she pauses and includes this comic scene at one point in the novel where one of the writers is teased for being such a dandy. And a dandy in the 1880s would have at least some association with homosexuality as well as possibly effeminate dressing. So there's this brilliant line in the novel where Evan looks around at his fellow rioters and remarks that we certainly were a queer looking lot of women with black faces and beards and whiskers poking out under the white caps. The main character of the Rebecca Rioter is a Welsh labourer, and he's one of Rebecca's followers. But as I mentioned, he's also in love with Miss Gwenllian, who is an unobtainable woman given this massive gulf between their social classes. But Evan is also drawn to Bill, who, and this is a spoiler if you haven't read the novel, turns out to be Gwenllian's brother. So on the one hand, Evan's expression of desire for Bill is ostensibly and quite obviously gay in one sense, Bill has been rescued by Evan in the same way that Evan rescues Gwenllian. He has been taken home by Evan and he shares Evan's bed. Bed sharing may be kind of common in this period. There's a limited amount of space, but Evan's feelings for Bill are fairly obvious, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. So Evan expresses his desire for Bill. Well, actually, we'll look at that now. The quote on the slide. Evan and Bill. Evan says, "I thought more of him than anyone except Miss Gwenllian. He was fond of me in his own quiet way, but he did not care for me in the passionate, jealous sort of way I cared for him." The fact that Bill and Gwenllian are brother and sister can deflect that gay reading, because Evan really fancies Gwenllian, and that can explain why away the same-sex content. He sees Gwenllian in her brother Bill, and that's what he's really thinking about. He's thinking about Gwenllian. But the reverse is also true. Marrying a brother when you fancy their sister, or marrying their sister when you're in love with a brother, was not only something that happened in real life, it is also it's quite a common literary trope for same-sex desire. So the kind of erotic triangle with brother and sister and Evan can be read in both as a deflection of the gay desire and as a reinforcement of it. So okay, so we'll come back to the triangle, but that's Evan and Bill. They're queer bedfellows. What I want to suggest is that Evan's love for Miss Gwenllian is also queer, or rather it's lesbian, because Evan is, I argue, an avatar of his author. And there are times when Amy Dilwyn's voice clearly swamps that of this otherwise convincing working class Welsh character. And you can hear her voice when he starts talking about Christian fraternity, for instance. But Evan also ventriloquizes some of Amy's most intimate writing in her diaries. So there's another way, and less obvious way, in which Evan's creator's voice intrudes. And I'll show you an example of that. So this is Evan talking about Gwenllian. He says, "I wonder whether my worship of her and longing for her gave my mind any sort of influence over hers, whether my thought was like an invisible thread joining our two minds together and moving at one end when pulled at the other." And in her diary, there is this kind of parallel statement or thinking. "Does my spirit, which is constantly seeking for Olive and yearning for her, exercise any influence over hers, or ever meet hers, so to speak, in that strange, unseen and immaterial world?" And there are lots and lots of examples of the way that Amy writes about Olive being repeated in the novel. And in fact, Evan ventriloquizes Amy when he's talking about Bill too. So that quote, "He was fond of me in his own quiet way, but he did not care for me in the passionate, jealous sort of way I cared for him." We can see that as an echo of Amy's diary from August 1872. Her, Olive's regard for me is but a quiet, ordinary affair, and not 100th part of my passionate love for her. So we could argue that the same-sex desire between the two men amplifies the lesbian desire between Evan, if we think of him as a woman in disguise, and Gwenllian. And disguising one woman in a relationship with another woman is a very common trope, again, of lesbian literature, and sometimes that one woman disguised as a man was part of lesbian life as well. Or, and this is where the trans and the bi come in, I don't think it's possible to say that Evan is just a woman in disguise. He seems to be both male and female, or masculine and feminine, in the same moment. That is, we could describe him as transgender, and specifically as occupying that state of trans, the indeterminate space, or the space of crossing, rather than necessarily as a binary male or binary female. So the erotic relationships with Gwenllian, which I have read as lesbian, and with Bill, which is suggestively gay in the text, are both there in the trans identity of of Evan, sorry. And that's what my triangle at the top is trying to represent, this kind of this relationship with Gwenllian and Bill. I gave a much longer version of this argument at a public talk in the Glenvivian, which had all the theory behind homoerotic triangles and male triangles and lesbian triangles, and which I'm going to spare you right now. But at the end of this talk, a member of the audience asked, couldn't this just be a representation of bisexuality? And I kind of thought, well, it really hadn't occurred to me, but absolutely, yes, I think it is a fair point. So in Evan, I think we get lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans identities all in one complex literary character. So I want to look quickly at some other queer avatars in Dilwyn's work. Having used a male avatar to represent same-sex desire in the Rebecca Rioter, Dilwyn created a female version in Jill. Jill is the protagonist of the novel of that name, Jill, which was published in 1884, and it's basically about a young woman who runs off to London to seek her fortune and disguises herself as a maid. So there's a cross-class disguise, and she is determined to become financially independent and have an adventure. She's not going to be limited by being a proper lady. Like Evan, Jill loves outdoor life. She too is in love with a socially superior and unobtainable woman because she's in disguise as a servant, so she appears to be of the wrong class. If Evan plays with cross-dressing, then Jill adopts a cross-class disguise, which also means that she becomes more masculine. She's allowed to go places, do things that a more upper-class woman wouldn't be able to do. But I'm not going to go into the gender dimensions of masculinity, other than to say that Dilwyn's lesbians are generally masculine, lower class, and often Welsh. Both Evan and Jill are also criminals in different ways. Evan is a poacher and later a murderer, while Jill is involved in lesser crimes, but still kind of outrageous for the lady that she is by birth: thefts, forgeries, and fraud. Both have strong chivalrous tendencies, and both are improved morally by their unrequited love. And Jill, as a woman in love with another woman, in very obvious terms, is a very early and obvious example of a fictional lesbian character. Jill is fascinating, but I'm really only using her here as a stepping stone, as a way of connecting to another male, arguably lesbian avatar, Sylvester. Sylvester is a character in A Burglary, and Dilwyn once said that she despaired of one-dimensional villains, and Sylvester is a complex and sympathetically drawn villain. And he has much in common with Jill, and in some ways is a prototype for Jill. A Burglary is published before Jill. So both of them, both Jill and Sylvester, are, as all Dilwyn's lesbian characters are, in love with another unobtainable woman. They're both criminals in similar terms, this time theft, fraud, embezzlement, and lots of lying on both counts. They both describe themselves as cold-hearted and unfeeling, really unfeminine, anti-feminine traits, particularly in Jill. They're both selfish and therefore really surprised by the fact that they start to feel love for somebody. They can't work out whether what to do with this new feeling. They both have uncertain class identities, Jill because she's in disguise, but Sylvester because he comes from lowly and quite troubled origins, even though he's now a gentleman. And they both are associated with acting. Jill is forced to act because she's in disguise as a servant and can't reveal her true identity. And Sylvester is an accomplished actor. And he actually pretends to be a poacher when he is committing a burglary, and later he is exposed, this identity is exposed when he plays a similar role on the stage. Okay, so remember, Sylvester is a version of Jill, who is a version of Evan, and in that sense, he's one of Dilwyn's lesbian characters, but Sylvester is also a double of Imogen. Remember Imogen? She is the tomboy heroine of a burglary. She's in love with her cousin Ethel. She's enjoying an outdoorsy life on equal terms with her brother, and she's trying to find a way to give back to the world, to change the world. Amy Dilwyn actually called this novel, she gave it an informal subheading about humbugs. Anyway, never mind, going off on a tangent. So how is Imogen a double for the villain of the book? She's a good Victorian heroine. Okay, I'm going to try and explain. Imogen is captivated and has fallen hopelessly in love with Ethel. Meanwhile, Sylvester is hopelessly in love with Imogen. Both Ethel and Imogen have improving influences on their admirers, hence the subtitle, which is Unconscious Influence. And as I mentioned before, Dilwyn believed that her beloved Olive had an improving influence on her, always leading me on to the better, she says. But there's much more going on in this novel than meets the eye, because Imogen, for all her goodness, and Sylvester, for all his villainy, are closely linked by language and plot. I don't have time to go there. There are lots and lots of textual examples, but one will have to suffice here, and that is the way that they're both described as intruders, and therefore they are both textually linked to the crime that Sylvester goes on to commit. He breaks into a house, or he is let into the house by Imogen, in fact, and he goes on to commit the burglary of the title. Imogen is described as an intruder in the chapter that just leads up to that burglary, so she's obviously linked in the use of that language. So what I want to suggest now, though, is that Sylvester is not only one of Dilwyn's lesbian characters, as I've shown him as a version or perhaps a prototype of Jill, he's also Imogen's proxy. So we can see the way that he acts in the novel as kind of a wish fulfillment for Imogen, or fulfilling Imogen's wishes or desires, perhaps is a better word. And I think I might be able to explain what I mean by reference to some critical readings of Great Expectations by Dickens, in which the malign and villainous character of Orlick, I mean, he's barely a character, he's more of a plot device, he appears at convenient moments. Orlick threatens to beat Pip up at various times, but it's actually Mrs. Joe who has made Pip's life a misery, who ultimately gets attacked by Orlick. And Alexander Welsh argues that Orlick is Pip's doppelganger, his double, who acts out Pip's secret or even subconscious desires, Orlick in whom the aggressive and sexual demands of the hero are strangely absorbed. Imogen is powerfully attracted to Ethel, and in fact, she's described as having fallen violently in love with Ethel. But Imogen maintains a facade of detached indifference, this sort of coldness, again, that is associated with lots of Dilwyn's female or Dilwyn's lesbian characters. But one night, Imogen goes out with her brother to go fishing in the early hours, and in the darkness they leave the house by a window, and she leaves that window open, and Sylvester immediately enters the house and goes straight to Ethel's room, where he takes her jewels, and then discovering that Ethel is awake and has seen him, he ties her up on the bed before making his escape with her jewel box. It's not hard to read a sexual subtext to this scene of theft of the theft of Ethel's jewels. We have the detail about how Ethel thinks about this, how she responds, her fears about what he might do to her, and they are unspoken. We just have all kinds of horrible thoughts and fears which rush across her mind, and they remain unspoken, but I think within those we could infer that sexual attack is one of them. But more symbolically and perhaps more convincingly, jewels are all associated with love tokens. They're worn next to the skin as a proxy possibly for an absent lover. Jewels are associated with lesbian writing and lesbian imagery, particularly pearls, which is brilliantly summed up in a critical essay about Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, entitled "Did Mrs. Danvers Warm Rebecca's Pearls?", which is brilliant. And it's that whole imagery has then been summed up in a poem by Carol Ann Duffy, who imagines just that, Mrs. Danvers, a servant warming her mistress's pearls. Ethel's jewels in a burglary also specifically represent her wealth and her value on the marriage market. So some of the quotes on the slide there express this. Miss Ethel Carton is possessor of more splendid jewels than any other spinster in the kingdom, and she cuts out everyone else in that line wherever she goes. She's going to a ball. She's seen first going to a ball, which is essentially a marriage market. So at any time that her wealth and her jewels are referred to, the talk immediately turns to her eligibility. And indeed, she herself is described as a jewel in her costly and in gilded setting. So my argument is that Sylvester fits the mold of Dilwyn's lesbians: male, masculine, criminal, in love with an unobtainable woman, often using cross-dressing or cross-class disguises. As I mentioned, Sylvester is a gentleman, but he acts out the role of or takes on the guise of a poacher for his burglary. But also that in the novel, he is a double. He is acting out the subconscious and unruly desires of the tomboy Imogen, who is a woman in love with another woman. So this is the last slide, and I'm drawing it all to a conclusion, or a close at least. These are the words on the slide, which were written by Amy Dilwyn in a diary entry when she is imagining herself as a knight devoted to her lady love. She rebukes herself for her foolishness, and she says, "All romantic and foolish notions had best go to bed and stay there forever. I must say, mine are very well behaved and don't trouble me often. I am afraid to let them out often, because if once they see the light, they acquire a vigor that makes them hard to hold in hand." What I've tried to show is that she translated her physical and erotic desires and fantasies, her exploration of gender and sexuality in particular, but also class and national identity. And she translated those into her vigorous novels and into a set of very versatile and complex avatars. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. That was really interesting. I was particularly fascinated by the relationship between Evanville and Gwenllian. Basically, anybody would like to ask any questions, please do. Oh, and apparently, I do apologise. Apparently, my camera wasn't working earlier, so this laptop is crap, so I do apologise. So if you'd like to ask a question, I think the easiest way will probably be to put it in the Q&A. I think we're doing that. We've got a couple in there already. So, Kirsty, if we can start with the first one from Derek. Has anyone trawled the Margam Castle archives for letters to or from Olive or other mentions about her from someone outside the Dilwyn family? We only get Amy's view of life. Are there any other views? And did Olive keep a diary?
Good question. Can you hear me with this new setup? It's just that I can hear you better when I've got these on. But can you hear me?
The volume's a bit low.
Volume's a bit low. Okay. Let me have a look. I can use the same
I was using before. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, we'll use that. Okay, so I am not aware of Olive having left any diaries or letters. There is a travel journal which Thomas Methuen and Campbell, actually, of Penrice, showed me, dug out of his archives, and so I have seen Olive's writing, which was really exciting. But it wasn't anything about Amy, so it doesn't give her side of things. I would love there to be letters. I have sort of this fantasy of somebody unearthing a box, but my understanding of Olive was a spinster. She was not the oldest daughter, and although she was an heiress, she what happened in the Talbot family after her older sister Emily passed on is that really there isn't anything left. I would love to be proved wrong, and I haven't properly researched it because it's not quite central to what I'm doing, but I haven't come across anything, I'm afraid, Derek. I wish I had, and if you do, let me know.
Okay, and the next question is, can Evan be interpreted as genderqueer, gender fluid?
I think he is, in the sense that he has a lot of feminine traits. He is using Amy Dilwyn's own words at times. The Rebecca rioters themselves have been interpreted as quite genderqueer by recent historians. Rhiannon Jones, for example, talks about this deliberate blurring of gender in the performance of, well, in wearing women's clothes, but not really trying to pass as women, trying to become something more than the individual, and doing that through a deliberate blurring of gender, sort of moving into this carnivalesque space where all of these boundaries are blurred. So, for example, the Rebecca rioters would wear false beards, even though they were men and might have a beard underneath, but there would be this kind of deliberate use of, so they'd be there in a female clothes, which could even be a ball gown, but was more often kind of peasant women's clothes, with swords and beards and sometimes all sorts of other kind of elaborate get-up. So the actual historical writers themselves were quite genderqueer in terms of disrupting gender, and I think I tend to see Dilwyn's own genderqueerness in terms of a mixing of masculine and feminine. And I think Evan is a perfect example of that. She's drawn to that disruptiveness, and so yeah, I see him as, I've described him elsewhere as a trans figure, and what I meant really was that, as I said, sort of he's occupying this intermediate liminal space, and or possibly occupying all of the genders at once. Does that answer that question?
Thank you. How were Dilwyn's novels received? Did readers pick up on these avatars?
Good question. They were received really well. She was compared to people like Austen and Dickens, favourably compared to Dickens, because she was regarded as drawing much less sentimental portraits of the working class. People noticed that she was, I think they noticed her female figures more than anything else. There's a review of Jill which remarks that it is only populated by women, and the men are kind of cardboard cutouts who just walk along, cross the scene when they're needed for the plot, but otherwise they're completely ignored. I haven't found any evidence for people homing in on these on the fact that the characters were genderqueer, or necessarily that Amy Dilwyn was herself in any way connected with them, which I've used the sort of autobiographical readings quite heavily. But reading Victorian reviews makes you realise that it wasn't necessarily startling to find a woman expressing being in love with a woman in a novel, and that our own understanding of what it means to be lesbian really does sometimes colour our sort of sense of when we read Victorian novels as, oh goodness, isn't this scandalous? And in fact, it wasn't at the time. It was just Jill got a really good review. What really worried Victorian reviewers of Jill was the fact that Jill was an upper class woman. Never mind that she was disguised, but she was born in the right class. Therefore, it was totally unrealistic that she could be a criminal. She couldn't possibly lie or steal because of her class. So that was an unrealistic point about Jill.
Okay, thank you. Have you ever come across any representations of avatars of Amy's late fiance, Llewellyn Thomas, within her work? His death had a big impact on her life and possibly influenced her future sexuality.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't know enough about Llewellyn Thomas to be able to say whether there are representations of him, but now you've asked the question, I will have to have a good think about it. I don't entirely agree that his death had a huge impact on her life. I think the evidence from her diaries suggests that his marriage proposal had a huge impact on her life, and it scared her witless. She destroyed his letters, unfortunately. She recounts in her diaries the moment when she burned his letters, and this is about 4 years after his marriage proposal, 4 years after his death. They came quite quickly. So she accepts his marriage in October. And it's a really bizarre entry. She describes the weather, going to church, and then there's one line that says, Llewellyn asked me to marry him, and I said yes, and that's it, which is really weird. And then there is some excitement about the preparation for marriage, but then she says, she's packing up her things, and she says, she's really upset because she said, I may never return to this room again, at least as Amy Dilwyn. So, but it's still kind of, she's not sure if she's going to come back as Amy Dilwyn or not, but she's heading off to London to marry Llewellyn, and then he dies. And she does go into mourning, and her diary becomes quite fragmented. There is a shock. So I agree that his death did have a big impact on her life, but I think it's because of her own inner battles and what she talks about later when she's burning Llewellyn's letters. She kind of speaks to him in her diary, and she says, I'm reading your letters, and I feel, this is me paraphrasing badly, it's not Victorian English, I feel guilty and bad about this because you wrote in your letters that I seem so cold and impassible. I didn't deserve your love, but she says, yeah, you describe me as cold and impassible, but I was like raging like a furnace inside with doubt and indecision about what to do. She clearly had really grave doubts about the marriage. And when she talks about Olive, who she describes as her wife eventually, and she says, surely after wooing her since I was 15, she must be my wife now. She was already hopelessly in love with Olive before she accepted Llewellyn's proposal. So I have tended to see the marriage proposal as what precipitates a crisis in Dilwyn's life rather than his death. They were clearly good friends. He was a friend of the family, and I don't think she meant him any harm. I'm sure she got on with him, but there's no evidence in her diaries that she was anything other than worried. And she mentioned several times, she says, today is the anniversary of the day when I said, when I agreed to marry a man with whom I was not in love. She's pretty explicit about it.
Thank you. Do you know if Amy Dilwyn ever met the ladies of Llangollen or Anne Lister? The ladies of Llangollen would be too early. They died quite a long time before that. But can I just expand on that? Do we know if she was in touch or had any correspondence, met with those that we've since been able to identify as possibly LGBT?
I wish I could say yes. Nobody really famous that I have been able to trace. She met loads of famous people. She was moving in prestigious circles in London as her father's companion. She met lots of politicians and she met lots of writers. But by the time she was in her late 20s, she was physically unwell, so she stopped going to London and she became very isolated for sort of the most productive years of her literary life. That said, she was clearly aware of other people. obviously from her, I only know what she's written in her diaries, and that leaves out more of her life than it includes. So I can't say she didn't have correspondence with people. I can't say that she didn't know people, but I don't have any evidence that she did. But what she did do was clearly she was aware of other women who loved women. So she describes a friend of hers, for example. She sort of mentions this woman who, once I saw her with Mrs. So-and-so, I realized that, you know, that's why she's talking about her all the time. Adelaide Proctor, she describes as thinking that this was poetry by a woman who did have, who loved another woman, I think is what she says, which was fairly astute. She talks, so she recognizes other women, but I don't know if she knew them. And I did for quite a while think she seemed very isolated, but then her diaries finished in 1875. She was all over the place after that. She, you know, so we don't know anything.
Thank you. The identification with the knight-errants is very interesting, particularly since they often hide displaced desire in medieval context. The knight-errant often views the unattainable lady he loves as an almost holy figure. Is there a religious element in Dilwyn, or any idea of an object of love as an object of devotion?
Good question, Maria. And given that I know you're a lot better informed about medieval tropes than I am, well, I mean, yes, Amy Dilwyn, this is exactly how she views Olive. In fact, well, there is this sense of that they are connected by religion. And there is a dreadful moment in Dilwyn's life when Olive seems to be moving down a slightly different religious route to Dilwyn, and she feels that would disconnect them. She talks about them knowing each other in Christ, and that maybe Olive will understand just how much she has meant to Amy when in the other world. There are kind of moments when she imagines that they're connected. She knows Olive's in church in somewhere on the Gower, and you know, there is that sort of praying at the same time. But she also says that she wonders if she loves God's creation more than God, and she worries about whether the level of adoration that she has for Olive is, she doesn't use the word blasphemous, but it's almost whether it is religiously acceptable, whether she's making a mistake. So she does, yeah, she specifically more than one time is putting Olive, turning Olive into a deity, and that you know, clearly has potentially difficult consequences for the one true God. I mean, there is a this connection through religion for women who are physically apart and who are unable to be together. You know, is again a really common lesbian trope, and I think combined with the kind of idea of medieval knights and romantic love, it's a really important one for Dilwyn. Dilwyn became less religious, or certainly more troubled in her religion. She didn't feel that her religion would sustain her when she became more depressed in the 1870s. And I'm not sure where she ended up in religious terms, but certainly in her 20s and early 30s, she was devoutly religious, and Olive sharing that high Anglican religion was a part of their connection.
Thank you. Is it possible that Amy was born intersexual? I
don't know. Is the short answer to that. Would that mean? I mean, is that meaning a kind of hermaphrodite? I
think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Don't know. I don't think so, but I'm not qualified to say. She had her illness, the thing that disabled her for years, was a progressive condition. It was painful. It stopped her walking, and it was associated, as far as I can tell, having looked at some Victorian medical manuals, it was a gynecological problem. and she something like inflammation of the cervix. She was using silver nitrate or nitric acid. She had an operation. Every time she went to the doctor, a specialist, she had to take her sister as a chaperone. So I know that, and she talks about waiting until the change of life, and she does seem to get better. I mean, she's walking into Swansea every day from the Mumbles, because and it's difficult to know whether this is, it's postmenopausal and she's better, she's got over this real debilitating, physically painful problem, but also there's the question about how far some of her disability was psychosomatic, in the sense that she was clearly just desperately bored and upset at the constraints of Victorian womanhood, and that once she becomes this man of business, she enters a new lease of life. I mean, she's playing water polo, hockey, fishing, and this is a woman who had been for 20 years or so on a sofa. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but certainly in gynecological terms, she was receiving treatment for I think what is coded as woman's trouble at the time.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so apologies for the people who did post a few questions which we weren't able to get around to. So I think we're going to have to leave it there. Can I draw your attention, please, to the chat box? And there'll be a link posted there for, sorry, I've just lost my finger. There'll be links posted there for the talk. So that just remains for me to say thank you very much, Kirsty. That was really interesting, fascinating. Hopefully, is there anywhere that if the questions weren't answered, they could post them somewhere?
I will answer those last few questions if I can keep them and get in touch with people. I don't know how the technology works, but I'm sure there will be a way. I know Alice and Emma, and I don't know Rabia, but I'm sure I will be able to find out how to answer that. That's a difficult question. I'm glad I didn't have to answer that on air.
Oh, don't ask me. I'm dreadful on technical things. Right, well, once again, thank you very much, Kirsty. It was really fascinating, and I'm sure everyone else will agree.
Thank you. I'd really appreciate it if you could fill in that form. I know it's a bore, but I need to prove that this matters to some people, so please fill it in.
If yes, please all fill in the form.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.